I invite the member for Columbia River Revelstoke to lead the House in prayer or reflection.
Thank you, Mr. Creator. Haionapi nitus. Creator, we give thanks for the bounty of our province, for our ancestors, our people, our land and resources, and for all living things. We vow to tend with care and dignity with our heritage on behalf of all British Columbians, and above all show kindness and love to and for all living things. May we always move respectfully forward with all means necessary to serve the good of the people. Iksukavi.
Introductions by members. Madam Clerk.
Introduction of bills. Private members' time.
Member for Burnaby North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When my mother was just a few years younger than I am today, she gave me this piece of advice. Don't get old, she told me. When I was a young woman, she said, men would leap up to give me their seats on the bus. They would rush to hold doors open for me. Now, she said, when I have arthritis in my hips and my hands and I could use a little extra help, no one offers me a seat anymore. And when people rush to open doors, it's so they can get through ahead of me. I've become invisible in my old age. And Mr. Speaker, I've begun to notice the same thing happening to me. Do women lose respect as they age? Are older women treated with less respect than older men? And if so, why is that? Does it matter? Is it a social problem we should be concerned about? And if it is, what are we going to do about it? These are the kinds of questions I'll be addressing in my statement this morning about women and aging. Let me begin by describing the invisible older woman syndrome. Yes, it is a thing. You can Google it. The invisible older woman syndrome is a social phenomenon that starts to affect many women at the age of about 45. They start to feel irrelevant. The women's movement has made great strides, and the lives of women are much less constrained today than they were in our mother's time or our grandmother's time. But women still tend to be judged by their physical appearance and perceived childbearing and child-rearing capacity, attributes which are all associated with youth. So when women age, they feel less valuable to society, and they are not imagining it. Studies from around the world confirm that older women are less likely to be hired or promoted than are older men or younger women. The results of a comprehensive field experiment published in 2017 found evidence that when candidates are being interviewed for jobs, physical appearance plays a bigger role in the assessment of women's qualifications than it does for men. Furthermore, it found evidence that older women are judged by interviewers to be less attractive and therefore less qualified than older men or younger women. These conclusions are based on evidence gleaned from over 40,000 job applications. And scientific research aside, social media and journalism's fixation on finding out if 80-year-old Nancy Pelosi, arguably the third most powerful person in the world, has had plastic surgery kind of proves the point. As one opinion piece put it, ambitious women have to look pre-embalmed when they hit the big numbers, knowing that if they look anything like Bernie Sanders, who's actually 2 years younger than Pelosi, they will actually cease to exist. As another journalist put it, the mere fact that Nancy Pelosi is Speaker of the United States House of Representatives proves she's had a facelift. Another study revealed that when looking for a place to live, older women are more likely to be told by prospective landlords that an advertised rental suite is not available, but the same unit is then offered to younger applicants. Women who divorce in later years are less likely than their husbands to remarry. And I think we all know at least one older woman who was terrified she would spend the rest of her life alone when her husband left her. And it's not an idle fear. Almost half of single, widowed, or divorced women over the age of 65 live below the poverty line. and their poverty rate is double that of older men. That women disappear as they age is embedded in our culture. It's the premise of the Alfred Hitchcock classic, The Lady Vanishes, in which an elderly governess disappears on a train, and no one can remember what she looked like or even that she was there on the train at all. In the end, it turns out she was a British spy. In fact, according to one article I read in preparation for this statement, intelligence agencies have been more likely to recruit middle-aged women than the stereotypic Mata Haris because they tend not to get noticed. Then there's the iconic scene from the Netflix sitcom Grace and Frankie, in which the older Jane Fonda has a dramatic meltdown when a male sales clerk remains oblivious as she tries to get his attention, but immediately notices and serves a young, attractive female customer instead. Visibility can be infuriating, but it can also be life-threatening. For example, we know that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women workers and family caregivers. But according to medical journals, the impact on older women, especially in long-term care, has been ignored everywhere in the world. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to conclude this portion of my statement by reminding us of the often quoted saying, "Men age like wine, women age like milk, and sour milk is something you throw away." Thank you.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for West Vancouver, Capilano.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the MLA from Burnaby North. Well, it's been a long journey for women, and it continues to be. And I thank the groundbreaking women that came before me and started to open the door. And I thank the amazing young women coming up behind who are kicking that door open. All too often, it feels like getting older means being erased from a culture that equates youth and beauty, or youth with beauty and beauty with value. The world remains rife with ageism and sexism for older women. But I do see more and more of that narrative changing. I'm seeing more roles being written for, I'll call them mature women in movies, and I see more women leaders and an expectation that women will be leaders regardless of age. So a friend once told me when a woman hits 50, she becomes invisible. Now, from the MLA from Burnaby North, I did not know there was actually a syndrome called Invisible Older Women Syndrome, but I have just learned something. So perhaps my friend was not too far from the truth. But I think aging is a woman's superpower. As we age, we're more likely to be able to live our own life with our truth and be comfortable with who we are and the value that we bring to others. As I age, I get smarter. But growing up as a woman in the 80s and 90s did result in some traditional baggage that so many women feel at my age and are trying to get rid of. That's that self-doubt, the instinct to defer to others, and the very annoying habit of when you apologize to someone in the grocery store and they're the one that actually walked into you. So I'm very lucky that my daughter is growing up in a Me Too generation, where there isn't in the back of her mind, there's traditional gender roles that are going to guide her life choices. And then when someone or some situation, she finds herself being disrespected because she's a young woman, she can recognize that now, as we perhaps didn't, and she can call it out. But hopefully, because of all we've learned as we age, she won't have to do that. There is a consequence, however, to longevity, and we can't forget that there are a number of continuing social issues that impact women disproportionately in their quality of life while aging. As our society ages, the ratio of women to men continues to increase. In Canada, there are 2 times as many women living after the age of 85 and 5 times as many over 100. The poverty rate for senior women in Canada is almost double that of men. The largest group of poor seniors are single, widowed, or divorced women living over 65 living alone, and almost half of those live below the poverty line, with isolation being a common struggle for senior women. One of the top factors pushing women into poverty later in life is the traditional role that they play, and that traditional role does remain in many ways today, in the workplace and in their families. Women are much more likely to work part-time than are men. Women continue to approximately make 70 cents per every dollar earned by a man, which further exacerbates low-income rates for women, especially those who live alone or are single mothers. Women also experience more disruption in their careers as they take time off to have children and be caregivers. Now, I noticed something several years ago when I was managing a group of women, that it wasn't unusual for a woman employee, when she came to let me know that she was pregnant and she was going to plan her maternity leave, that she wouldn't finish that sentence without apologizing to me. So this is apologizing for what should have been the happiest time in her life. And then I found I did it myself. When I told my boss I was going to take time off because I was having a daughter, I apologized. And he looked at me like he was a bit annoyed, like I'd chosen a very inconvenient time to become a mother, and men don't experience this. So the preponderance of women living in poverty is also due in part to biology. Women simply live longer than men, 83 years in Canada on average versus 79 for men. They are much more likely to outlive their spouses and their savings. That leaves them having to save more for their retirement. My own 94-year-old mother often jokes that she would have saved more had she known she was going to live this long. But I wouldn't trade aging for anything. Mr. Speaker, the alternative is not very appealing. I have learned and grown for all of the journeys and experiences of my lifetime, and it makes me a kinder and gentler person, but I will still never wear purple or a red hat. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Burnaby North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for your age-affirming observations. In my opening remarks, I spoke about the invisible older woman syndrome, but disappearing isn't all that happens to older women. Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, these are all familiar fairy tales beloved by generations of children. And these narratives shape our self-image and our relationship to the world. And what do they all have in common? A young, beautiful woman is saved by a handsome young prince, but saved from who? In every iconic fairy tale, the young, beautiful heroine is saved from a jealous, bitter, old woman. Even the classic Wizard of Oz is premised on the vindictiveness of an older neighbor who morphs into a witch. And speaking of which, what are some of the other nouns commonly used to refer to an older woman? Hag, biddy, crone, battle axe, old bat. Mr. Speaker, even today, when women have more rights than ever before, more opportunities than ever before to lead fulfilling lives and influence the world around us on our own terms, it continues to be normalized, perhaps subconsciously so, that women are expected to compete with other women for the attention and approval of men. It continues to be normalized that as we age, our status, our worth, will be stolen by younger women. So we all, women, men, younger, older, we all have a role to play to break the stereotype. We need to open our eyes and start seeing older women in stores, on public transportation, in the workplace. We need to start including older women in our research. We need to start recognizing that older women, like older men, have a lifetime of experience, wisdom, and gravitas to contribute as we grapple with the challenges that confront our planet, our communities, our homes. And finally, Mr. Speaker, just as women of all ages are undoing the helpless damsel in distress stereotype, we older women must resist being typecast as crabby old witches. Thank you.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Columbia River Revelstoke.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So nice to see you. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to rise and speak about the tourism industry, a pillar of this province's economy, and to highlight the cruise ship industry as a key contributing sector of our economic success. I had the great fortune in my career to work for Princess Tours, a subsidiary of Princess Cruises, and spent an enormous amount of time on our ships. The job took me to the jungles of Costa Rica, to Panama, Nicaragua, and of course the glaciers of Alaska, and so many other places and ports throughout the world. The tourism industry is BC's third largest economic sector, and we all know it has been the sector that has been hit the hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic, especially the cruise ship industry. Traditionally, April is the beginning of the Alaska cruise season, and as ships begin to reposition for Alaskan departures that typically run right through late September, it has been these ships that have brought tens of thousands of passengers to visit our beautiful ports of Vancouver, Victoria, Nanaimo, and Prince Rupert. Visitors all experiencing the beauty and hospitality of BC and leaving their hard-earned cash behind, supporting our local and provincial economies. British Columbia is the largest cruise region in Canada, accounting for more than 69% of all Canadian cruise traffic, with visitors from all over the world. Most cruisers come from the United States, while about one quarter from overseas and the rest from Canada. The cruise ship industry in BC is responsible for about $2.7 billion in economic activity. In Vancouver, each docking ship contributes approximately $3.17 million for a total of about $2.2 billion in economic impact. The industry creates around 20,000 direct and indirect jobs in BC. Here in Victoria, the industry is responsible for about 800 jobs, contributing about $130 million per year. In 2019, pre-COVID-19 times, 264 cruise ships visited Victoria with over 700,000 passengers who on average spent about $83 per person, with crew members spending on average about $113 per person locally. Mr. Speaker, it's obvious that the cruise industry is a key driver of economic activity within the tourism sector in BC. It represents one of the largest employers, yet is an industry that has been completely shut down. This in turn affects thousands of British Columbians and businesses who are directly impacted by the catastrophic effect of COVID that it has had on this industry. The industry has not only been under attack from COVID-19, but now is under pressure from the United States government. The Jones Act, which for decades has been deemed by the cruise industry as antiquated, is a federal U.S. law that regulates maritime commerce in the United States. Within that act is cabotage. Well, that relates directly to the transports of people and goods between the ports in the same country. If you have been on a cruise, you would note and have noticed that the amount of detail that is spent on recording passengers coming in and off ships, this is all due to the Jones Act. Cruise operators are highly motivated to avoid breaking the Jones Act because if they do not abide by the law, there are significant fines that are levied. Again, this is an act or a piece of legislation that cruise operators for years have believed that is antiquated and restricting. What most people may not know is that most cruise ship operating out of the United States ports are not registered in the United States and are subject directly to the Jones Act. To put this in simplistic terms, because of the Jones Act, cruise ships that were not built in the United States or not U.S. owned and with non-U.S. crews cannot travel directly between U.S. ports unless they stop in a foreign port. This means that a ship with a foreign crew or any way foreign cannot, as an example, go on a round trip from Seattle, Los Angeles, or even Alaska without stopping at a Canadian port, which of course would be Vancouver, Prince Rupert, or Victoria. Due to COVID-19, the Trudeau government curtailed the arrival of cruise ships into Canada until 2022. What that means is that cruise ships originating in the United States and destined for Alaska in 2021, and because of the Jones Act, would not be able to stop in Canada, thus preventing them from sailing north. This has been disastrous news for the American-based cruise companies and industries as they are repositioning to reopen their Alaska market this summer. In response, the decision to close our ports has in turn precipitated the passing of a bill by the Americans that will allow ships to go to Alaska without stopping in Canada. This bill was unanimously passed in a rare example of U.S. bipartisanship, and as I say, unanimously. President Biden signed the bill into law last week, which allows cruise ships to sail to Alaska without requiring them to stop in Canada. Well, what does that mean for BC and the thousands of British Columbians who depend on the arrival of these ships? It means that the millions of dollars of tourism-generated monies that were spent in our province will end up being spent in American ports like Skagway, like Ketchikan and Juneau, ports that are absolutely dependent on the cruise industry. Mr. Speaker, this new law represents an achievement the industry has wanted for years. The cruise industry has been asking for the repeal of this for years, and they finally have got it. All because 2 Alaskan senators and an Alaskan congressman took it upon themselves to do their jobs and fight for the well-being of their constituents who are so dependent on the cruise ship industry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for North Coast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under current U.S. law, foreign flag cruise ships traveling between U.S. destinations are required to stop at a foreign port in between. This rule has greatly benefited British Columbia, where Alaska-bound cruise ships have stopped in places like Victoria and Prince Rupert. A decision made by the federal government of Canada temporarily bans cruise ships from Canadian ports until February of next year to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Because of this, the recently passed Alaska Tourism Recovery Act temporarily allows Alaska-bound ships to bypass BC ports. This is a temporary measure with a sunset clause. The law is clear that the changes would be automatically rescinded when Canadian ports are reopened to cruise ships. My home community of Prince Rupert is ready and willing to welcome Alaska cruise passengers when it's safe to do so. We have a breadth of attractions for adventurous souls with world-class kayaking, whale and bear watching, and cultural experiences. Our restaurants cover the gamut from international cuisine to locally caught seafood. While things are gradually opening up across the province, it's still not safe enough to open international and US borders. This is for the health and safety of all Canadians. We are working with colleagues across the province, with the federal and US governments. Premier Horgan is meeting Alaska senators on June 9th on this very matter. The Transportation and Infrastructure Minister has sent a letter to his federal colleagues around the logistics of technical stops. The Tourism Minister has met with the US Consulate General in Seattle and discussed this issue. She has spoken to the Federal Economic Development Minister on the matter, and she has met multiple times with Ian Robertson from the Greater Victoria Port Authority. Ian is also a member of our Tourism Advisory Table. The BC Intergovernmental Relations Team meets with the Seattle Consulate weekly. Provincial government shares a common desire with the people of Alaska to see a safe return to the cruise ship industry to the benefit of both our regions. We're investing in tourism so we are ready when the borders open. On December 22nd, we announced a $100 million tourism-specific stream under the Small and Medium-Sized Business Recovery Grant Program as a response to a call to action from the Tourism Task Force. We've also delivered $5 million in dedicated relief funding that is being delivered by Indigenous Tourism BC for Indigenous tourism businesses. We have also invested $19 million to support small municipalities who are dependent on tourism to build, adapt, and diversify their tourism infrastructure. We've invested $20 million for tourism infrastructure projects supporting destination development. And we've invested nearly $14 million to support targeted tourism development partnership initiatives in the 6 tourism regions across BC to help the industry recover from COVID-19. We have also supported local community development management organizations with $60 million so they can retain critical staff and offset fixed expenses. And on May 27th, we announced a $50 million program for BC major anchor attractions. Honorable Speaker, the province will continue to support and defend BC's tourism industry and all the people, businesses, and communities who depend on it. I will continue to stand up for tourism businesses, and I look forward to receiving cruise passengers in Prince Rupert when it's safe to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, member. And of course, members are reminded we do not use members' personal names in statements. Recognizing the member for Columbia River Revelstoke.
There you got it.
There it is.
Well done, Mr. Speaker.
Wonderful part of the world.
Yeah, it is so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for their comments. the British Columbians and their families whose livelihood depend on tourism, and in this case cruise ships, deserve a much better fate. The problem we see before us today has been on the radar screen for over a year, yet nothing has really been done to address this issue. Mr. Speaker, this issue was in front of the provincial leadership as of February 12, 2021, when they were CC'd on a letter that was sent to our Canadian Prime Minister from the 2 Alaskan senators and Alaskan congressman informing them, and I quote, "As neighbours and economic partners, we are discouraged by Canada's lack of outreach before announcing this long-term closure," end quote. Mr. Speaker, upon receipt of this letter from the American politicians, red flags should have gone up immediately for the leadership of this province. Yet the seriousness of this threat to BC's cruise industry and those who depend on it was been downplayed from the start. It was dismissed by the Premier, who said it was, and I quote, "a blip," and assured British Columbians that chances of this law being passed by the American senators were, and I quote,
If I might remind the member, just before he goes further, that remarks that target specific members in this House go contrary to the spirit of this time. Of course, there are opportunities in question periods, speeches, etc., on other bills to target individuals.
The Minister of Tourism told British Columbians that the proposed American legislation was, I quote, "a temporary measure, and it was very unlikely." And the reason I make these comments, Mr. Speaker, is that they speak to a point that I'm going to be making. Well, the thing is on May 13th, the U.S. Senate passed unanimously and approved a bill to bypass Canadian borders for the duration that they were closed. A bipartisan action, Mr. Speaker, that virtually never happens in the United States. The biggest issue now for BC is that the new legislation has been signed into law by President Biden and will work to the advantage of the American-based ports, like Los Angeles and Seattle. This will allow U.S.-based cruise ships from the Los Angeles, Seattle, Alaskan run to completely bypass BC, a move that analysts say will likely become permanent. The British Columbians who work directly for indirectly for the BC cruise industry deserve better, or at least the same advocacy and respect the Alaskans received from their elected officials. Had action been taken immediately, and had the American concerns been taken more seriously when it first presented, the tourism calamity that is today and the tourism cruise calamity that will be tomorrow could have well be avoided. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Vancouver Hastings.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I come here today with a great sense of shame. Shame that fills my heart as a Vancouver MLA whose city is the anti-Asian hate crime capital of North America. I know that we are all ashamed of what this means. It means that reported hate crimes have gone up over 700%. It means that, as a recent poll found, 43% of British Columbians of Asian descent have experienced a racist incident in the past year. That's ranging from racial slurs to property damage to physical assault. That is almost half of the population. It means that as fear of the virus spread, so did hesitation to visit Asian-owned and operated businesses that have been a staple of our communities for decades. It also means that elders in our community are fearful now of walking on the streets. As I learned the other day, some elders are taking self-defense courses, learning how to use their aged limbs to protect themselves from the threat of physical violence on our streets. These elders are arming themselves with whistles in the hopes that if they are attacked on our streets, people will come to their aid and to protect them from violence and hatred that they may face. This is where we are today. To those elders who are to be revered and protected in this stage of their lives, I am ashamed that this is your reality today, and I am sorry. Despite the over 150 years of Asian immigration to Canada, we've yet to overcome the racism and xenophobia that exists among us. May is Asian Heritage Month, a time to acknowledge the contributions that the Asian community has made to British Columbia. Their blood, sweat, and hard work that is so deeply tied to the building of British Columbia. Whether it's our railway system, our agricultural system, our small businesses, our healthcare system, and the list goes on. Our history is also filled with tragic stories, like the fact that 2 Chinese workers died for every mile of railway that was laid across the Rockies, and so many more. Yet despite these contributions and the generations of families that live here in BC, far too many are met with hatred today. What is a hate crime? It's a crime committed against a person or property that is motivated by hate and includes things like assaults, uttering threats, criminal harassment, and graffiti. Hatred is an ugly thing, and it's defined in law as an emotion of an intense and extreme nature that is clearly associated with vilification and detestation. It puts upon those individuals a feeling that they are to be despised, scorned, denied respect, and subject to ill treatment. This hatred is experienced in reality by our neighbors, like a Vancouver lawyer who was yelled at in his car when he was in the corner of Fraser and 41st Avenue by 2 men who screamed a racial slur. When he rolled down his window in misbelief, they threw garbage at him. Or a young woman who was spat at for walking too loudly on the seawall and has written about grappling with the impacts of this incident on her well-being. And terrible acts of violence. A 92-year-old who was forced out of a convenience store onto the sidewalk, or a woman who was punched in the head at a downtown bus stop. And these are just some of the hate crimes and the incidents that have been reported. So we need to ask ourselves, how do we bend this curve? How do we bring a sense of safety back to our communities and push back against this racism? As we learn and listen to the communities that are impacted, we are finding there are many tools that we need to use in solidarity to make our streets and our communities safe. Number 1, do not be a bystander. Hollaback, an organization, provides bystander intervention training to help arm us with knowing what we do if we witness a hate crime. And that includes the 5 Ds: distract, derail the incident by interrupting and diverting its attention, start a conversation with the victim to deflect, delegate, seek help from a third party that is more capable of intervening, call 911 if the situation is specifically unsafe, document, record the incident, always making sure that the person who's being recorded decides what's done with the footage. Delay, check with the person that's affected, ask them if they want you to sit with them or walk with them after the incident, and direct. If it is safe, intervene directly by addressing what is happening and confronting the perpetrator. There are also other supports that are coming. BC is launching a hotline that is intended to be a multilingual service not delivered by the police for British Columbians to respond and report incidents and receive support and referrals. We need to support our local Asian-run businesses that have not only been impacted by the pandemic, but this rising hate. We need to support those community organizations that are on the front line and are working to keep people safe. Mr. Speaker, I call upon all of us here today to stand in solidarity against the rise of hate crimes and all do what we can to support our neighbors and never be a silent bystander in the face of hatred. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Recognizing the member for Richmond North Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for her comments. As MLAs, we have a fundamental responsibility to not only represent our constituents, but represent the many diverse cultural groups that make up our communities. Regardless of our personal political beliefs, we must all be allies in our fight against racism and intolerance in this province. And amidst these horrific events, it gives me great hope and pride to see so many MLAs speaking out against the rise in anti-Asian hate that our province has experienced this past year. Although we are discussing anti-Asian racism, I think it is also important to recognize the heartbreaking discovery of a burial site of 215 children at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. Our hearts go out to the family of those impacted by this horrific discovery. This pandemic has shown a dark light on how deeply racism and intolerance are still rooted in parts of our society. Last year, more anti-Asian hate crimes were reported in Vancouver, a city of 700,000 people, than in the top 10 most populous U.S. cities combined. Almost 1 out of every 2 residents of Asian descent in British Columbia have experienced a hate incident in the past year. While I thank government for acknowledging the public's desire for more anti-racism initiatives by establishing an Anti-Racism Awareness Week, we have far to go if we are to truly eliminate hate and intolerance in our province. We need to take concrete steps that amount to more than just sympathy, which is why I wrote to the Premier and Attorney General last week outlining a 10-point plan of crucial actions government could take to truly forward our province's mission of eliminating racism. The official opposition has asked government to take the following steps. Number 1, activate a select standing committee on education to review policies and actions that have contributed to the rise in racism and conduct a comprehensive examination of the current state of racism in BC by working with organizations and community representatives to provide recommendations on how we can improve. Number 2, fund an anti-racism secretariat to monitor and quantify discrimination, promote preventative measures, and report on its progress to the Legislature by the end of this calendar year. Number 3, quickly implement and activate the hotline for British Columbians to report racist incidents announced on April the 30th, 2021. Number 4, increase funding to the multiculturalism and anti-racism programs. Number 5, develop more educational tools and resources for the K-12 education curriculum to combat racism and educate students about the contributions of immigrants to British Columbia. Number 6, ensure local police forces have sufficient resources to respond quickly and fully investigate hate crimes and racist incidents, including online reporting. Number 7, ensure that the Attorney General's Crown Prosecution Service treats racist incidents as a priority for charge determinations and prosecutions. Number 8, press the federal government on amendments to Section 718.2 of the Criminal Code with respect to sentencing for hate-inspired crimes to better define hate based on race. Number 9, apply to the National News Media Council for a review of media coverage to determine the extent, if any, to which language, visual depictions, and editorial content may have conditioned people to accept racial stereotyping and racial intolerance. And number 10, call upon major media outlets in Canada as well as social media outlets to implement a coherent public awareness campaign on racism and the unacceptable incidents of harassment in recent months in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of Canada's multiculturalism policy. I look forward to the Premier and Attorney General's prompt response. Implementing this step will go a long way to securing a bright and tolerant future for all, so we can work together to build a culture of acceptance where all people can feel safe, no matter their race, their religion, or their background. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Recognizing the member for Vancouver Hastings.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also like to thank my colleague for her very deep and powerful comments and acknowledge that many of us are wearing orange today from the recent and tragic discovery of the bodies of those children at Kamloops Residential School. I'd like to spend the rest of my time thanking organizations who are supporting people on the front lines of this increased instance of hate. Resilient BC supports an anti-racism network of organizations across BC on the front lines. This includes Queenie Chu and her fabulous team at Success, and Mosaic and Collingwood Neighbor House are all part of the anti-racism network. I'd like to acknowledge artist Christopher Say, who created a public service announcement, who wrote and directed Eyes Opened, which is a beautiful call to action and a tribute to Asian Canadian community and during this Asian Heritage Month. I'd also like to thank all the organizers of the May 29th Day of Action and all those who participated. It is always the show of solidarity and support from our community in response to these incidents that brings us hope for a better future. One where our elders can walk the streets without threats of violence and hatred. And throughout our history, it has always been the solidarity and action of groups like these that help us build a more equal society. And I know we all are very grateful. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Surrey South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all benefit from a society and an economy without barriers to inclusion. But every day, people with disabilities face barriers to accessing basic necessities like housing, employment, resources, and services. National Accessibility Week is an opportunity to celebrate the valuable contributions of people with disabilities and to recognize the efforts of individuals, communities, and workplaces that are actively working to remove barriers to access and inclusion. The theme this year, Disability Inclusion 2021, Leaving No One Behind. Well, that'll take some work. It won't be the default. Most people watching this or even hearing this right now are probably thinking, yes, of course, we should do that. That's nice. But it's not about me. I don't have a stake in this. So this morning, I'd like to be a bit provocative. No, I'd actually like to be a lot provocative. It's not about me or other people with disabilities. It's about you. The whole reason we have to have this week is because you, in the widest sense, have and continue to build a world and build policy that exclude us. That creates barriers for us. We don't do it to ourselves. We can't fix it or overcome it ourselves. It's about you, as individuals, as businesses, and as policymakers. So let me explain why you should care. In 2017, 22% of Canadians aged 15 and over, or about 6.2 million people, identify as having one or more disabilities. That's nearly a quarter of the population that might have an issue interacting with you, might not be able to access and purchase your services and products, might not be able to relocate to your community, or exercise their rights as citizens. Among those people with disabilities aged 25 to 64 who were not employed and not attending school, 39% want to work. That's nearly 650,000 people that are ready, willing, and able to work, but they aren't working because businesses aren't hiring them, and that's because the places of work aren't accessible. That's a huge untapped labor pool that could be mobilized to fill job openings. The reality is that as the Conference Board of Canada in January of 18, in a report titled The Business Case to Build Physically Accessible Environments shows, the number of Canadians living with physical disability that impairs vision, hearing, or mobility will rise by 1.8% per year between now and 2030. The total population growth in that same time will average less than 1% a year. The same report suggests that implementing measures to improve workplace accessibility would enable 550,000 Canadians to work more hours, increase GDP by $16.8 billion, and this larger pool of available workers would boost the total income of people with disabilities by over $13.5 billion. But yet here we are, still building barriers. Why are there no electric accessible vehicle charging stations? An example of how we're continuing to exclude, building barriers, and an example of bias, assuming no one with a disability would also have an electric car. Multi-story buildings with only one elevator, because when it's out of order, there's no access. Cities piloting e-scooters. Sounds like fun for some, but these are a huge barrier to people with disabilities who need clear sidewalks for safe routes, people with mobility aids that can't get by, and people who are blind can trip over haphazardly discarded scooters. What about, for example, the blocking of accessible parking spaces at an island health unit to use as a tented area during COVID? One action for a purpose eliminates access to the whole clinic. And what about policy barriers? Here's an example. A barrier to love and relationships. For those requiring income supports from government, a long-standing challenge, incomes are reduced for couples, treating these couples differently than two-income couples who are able to work. And now we're not just talking about access, we're talking about dignity. So I say again, accessibility is not my problem, it's society's problem, and we all have a role to play. You might not need these things today, but I didn't either until a split second changed my world to one where I couldn't even go home. These are truly fixable problems. They are barriers we can break down, but we have to see them and we have to make change. So here's some homework. If you're an individual member of the public, ask yourself, what biases do I hold? How can I be an ally? Do I know what to watch for? When I see a barrier, do I point it out and advocate for change? If you're on social media, do you use alt text for images and caption your videos? I'm still struggling to get this right myself. If you're a business owner, do an inventory. How accessible are you? What about your website or the apps you use for customer loyalty? Engage an expert for assistance. Put up a sign and ask your customers to tell you how you're doing, what you're doing well, and how you can do better. Make a plan to make changes when you learn you have deficiencies. If you're a municipal leader, do you have a disability advisory group? Are you actively engaging with them? Ask citizens with disabilities to share the challenges they face accessing their community. Review your bylaws. Check in with your planning and inspectors. Do they have enough knowledge to do their jobs properly? Do they need a crash course in what to watch for? Do you have an accessible parking bylaw? And are you permitting accessible and adaptive housing? If you're an MLA or cabinet minister, demand change. Let's make sure we put an access lens on all our work, not just, but starting with the Accessible BC Act. I ask this as your colleague, a friend, an advocate, and most importantly, as a person who knows personally how much good intentions aren't enough. I'm tired of feeling thankful when there's an accessible washroom or a ramp or a power door opener. I'm tired of fishy smelling freight elevators that are considered access to public places like restaurants. I'm tired of arriving at appointments to find the accessible parking is being used to house shopping carts or dumpsters or snow piles. I'm tired of having to explain to people why it is not okay for them to assume that I always want to have or always have someone with me to assist me. There is a lot to do. This week, this legislature can commit to change, Mr. Speaker. Let's see that we do.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Chilliwack, Kent.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I'm grateful for the privilege of speaking from the traditional unceded territories of the Stalo people, and although I am so thankful for this opportunity to discuss accessibility, I do acknowledge that I'm doing so during a time of profound grief, which even despite the awareness of, or the importance of this topic, it doesn't eclipse the trauma currently being experienced across our province. As the member opposite has highlighted so well, accessibility is everyone's problem. This week, May 30th to June 5th, is National Accessibility Week. It is also British Columbia's 4th annual Accessibility Week. This week is an important opportunity to recognize and show appreciation for the self-advocacy, support, and commitment of so many individuals, families, and organizations who work, speak up, and lead the way to inform us, to educate us on how to be inclusive and accessible throughout British Columbia. The British Columbia Aboriginal Network on Disability Society, or BCANS, is celebrating with National Indigenous Accessibility Week. They describe the importance of this week with the intersectional lens of indigeneity with the following. Honoring the rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada means honoring the rights of Indigenous peoples living with disability to be included and protected in our communities. And as they put it simply, if it's not accessible, then it's not acceptable. Societal and physical structures that interfere with accessibility are built on a history of norms, typical, average, and majority. Systems of attitudes, policies, environments that worked for most, or at least many, were good enough. For those who could not access, the fault or issue was squarely located within the individual, a history of blaming some people for not fitting neatly into boxes. But we know it's not some people. In BC, over 900,000 people aged 15 and older, about a quarter of our population, identify as having a disability. In Canada, 1 in 5 adults has a disability, and as our population ages, this number is expected to grow. Accessibility is a social, family, and economic issue as well. 55% of Canadians have a connection to physical disability in their daily life, either personally or through someone they care about, impacting how people work, buy, access services, travel, spend time together, and participate in our community. We also know that issues of accessibility impact disproportionately across our community. When interacting with impairments related to pain, mobility, flexibility, learning disabilities, mental health, cognition, vision, hearing, or communication, we know that age, gender, and race, aspects of identity that also have an impact on access in society, can compound and further impact accessibility. Based on Statistics Canada in 2019, roughly 1 in 3 Métis and First Nations people living off reserve had 1 or more disabilities, compared to 1 in 5 for non-Indigenous Canadians. The prevalence of disability increases with age, and although disability can occur at any time of life, rates range from 13.4% in youth to 41.7% in seniors. Also, women have a higher prevalence of disability than men regardless of age, at 26.5%. Only by identifying, removing, and preventing barriers can we move forward together to an inclusive BC where everyone has access to fully participate. That's why I'm so excited about the Accessible British Columbia Act that was introduced on April 28th of this year. Once passed, this act will enable us to move ahead with establishing new accessibility standards in areas such as service delivery, education, and the built environment.
If I might, if I might remind the member, we don't talk about legislation that's in front of the House. Acceptance speeches on that legislation, but thank you.
Thank you. I'm also very grateful for our government's announcement this past weekend that in celebration of BC's Accessibility Week, there will be new community grants aimed at improving accessibility and inclusion. Through Disability Alliance BC, with their mission to support people with all disabilities to live with dignity, independence, and as equal and full participants in the community, $500,000 in grants will be distributed to support local accessibility projects focusing on accessible education and learning, sports and recreation, arts, culture and tourism, community participation, emergency planning and response, or accessible employment. The pandemic has shown us what it looks like, what we are capable of when it comes to making accessibility a focus and a requirement. When so many of us suddenly had to change how we access our jobs, our colleagues, our families, our education, our services, we had to pivot immediately. As we celebrate this week, let us carry that learning forward far beyond these past months and truly embrace the idea that if it is not accessible, then it is not acceptable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, member. Recognizing the member for Surrey South.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for her comments. I appreciate her allyship. And she's right, nobody fits neatly into a box. And it's taken too long to recognize this and too long to change. But we have shown during this last year that we can pivot. So let's do that. Earlier, I cited a few of my daily barriers, but I asked my friends in the broader disability community theirs. And here are some examples. The move to self-serve only gas stations, because pumping gas is not actually a simple task for many drivers with disabilities. I'm pretty sure I know every full-serve station in the Lower Mainland in Victoria. Limited seating at event venues, always at the back and always limited to one person with a disability and one guest, like we don't have more than one friend or family member. Getting stuck in the hallway in buildings where there's braille signage on the elevator buttons, but not on the walls on the floor you need to visit. Restaurants with a majority of high-top tables or booths, because newsflash, these are not accessible options for wheelchair users or people with other mobility issues. Limited options for transportation. Temporary procedures initiated by TransLink during the pandemic made it very hard for people with disabilities to ride transit safely. Rideshare companies are not stepping up to provide wheelchair accessible service. And on this front, I'd argue companies would do a lot better if they hired some people with disabilities to help them innovate, because people with disabilities are experts in innovation, like the new prototype airline seating designed by a woman with a disability in Montreal. That's just one example. The incredible, and I do mean incredible, lack of accessible and adaptable housing options across the spectrum. Regular stresses of wondering if medical appointments might be canceled because an individual can't transfer independently onto inaccessible exam tables. Yes, the barriers are real, even in healthcare. And the worst, though, and still the most pervasive barrier, of attitudes. Attitudes about the value of people with disabilities, about their abilities, and about what accessibility means. What it all boils down to is the rights of people with disabilities are not being met. Governments at all levels are letting people down. If someone today was not able to access a public space because of the race, we would be rightfully mad as heck, and society would demand action. Yet if somebody today is unable to access a public space because the space is built to exclude them, we make excuses. It's too expensive, only a few people need it, it's not our market, it's too difficult. Well, that's just not good enough. This is National Accessibility Week, and it is a time to recognize people with disabilities and their accomplishments. But it's also a time to recognize that there are hundreds and thousands of people who are prevented from engaging fully, prevented from giving back. Just imagine how many more accomplishments we could celebrate if we made sure all people had access to the same things you do and take for granted. Because as the BC Aboriginal Network on Disability tweeted, if it's not accessible, it's not acceptable. Period. Full stop. Get mad with me. Get loud with me. It's 2021. Demand access for everyone.
Thank you, Member. Acting Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the House proceed to the consideration of motion number 9, standing on the order paper in the name of the member for Chilliwack.
Honourable members, unanimous consent of the House is required to proceed with motion 9 without disturbing the priorities of the motions preceding it on the order paper. Is leave granted? So ordered. I recognize the member for Chilliwack to move the motion.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I would like to move, be it resolved that this House recognize the 4th Accessibility Week and reaffirm its commitment to building an inclusive province that improves the lives of people living with disabilities. Honourable Speaker, we celebrate Awareness Weeks in British Columbia to highlight and create awareness to important issues. This week, we celebrate the abilities of people, recognize the individuals and organizations who continue to go above and beyond, and raise awareness about what each of us can do to make our province more inclusive. The recognition of Accessibility Week is supported by our government, and there'll be several events this week. The Minister and I had a kickoff event this morning. Yesterday, to start off Accessibility Week, we announced new community grants aimed at improving accessibility and inclusion. The grant funding will support organizations across the province in removing barriers and creating new local opportunities for British Columbians with disabilities. And we'll have more announcements throughout the week. Mr. Speaker, people with impairments are not disabled until they encounter a barrier that gets in the way of full participation in their communities. Our lives and communities are not built with disabled people in mind. But our government is committed to making BC a better place for people living with disabilities. We've introduced the Accessible British Columbia Act to remove barriers for people with disabilities. 25% of people identify as having a disability. That's 1/4 of our province that we have put barriers in front of. The ABC Act will identify and remove and prevent these barriers. Much of our work is ahead of us. To be a truly inclusive province, we must integrate accessibility into all aspects of our lives so that people living with disabilities can fully participate in their communities. And together we can create more opportunities for meaningful employment, support greater independence, and help facilitate full workplace and community participation for people with disabilities. It is so important that we are enshrining this week in Bill 6, the Accessible British Columbia Act. But it goes without saying that accessibility is something we must keep in mind every day of the year, especially if we want to identify, remove, and prevent barriers in people's lives. Mr. Speaker, I have had my own lived experience, but my role has driven me to become a better advocate. When I became an MLA, people from across the province reached out with their personal stories. And I must thank the member from Surrey South for her stories today. I share many of the same stories with her. Today I'll share some stories, in particular just my experience with parking lots yesterday. So I went to get my hair cut. Looks pretty good, right? And when I got there, and I've said in this house before, I circle businesses to find access and stuff. When I got there, there was an accessible parking spot, which had enough room for me to get my wheelchair out of my car. But the curb cut was around the corner. I had to go through the parking lot And sitting in my chair, I'm somewhat short, and you know, there's cars backing out of spots and stuff. This is hazardous. After I got my hair cut, I went and stopped at a store. They had an accessible parking spot, but the curb cut was in the middle of the parking spot, which made it so that if you left your car in the parking spot, you couldn't access the curb cut. So these are just two stories just from yesterday while I was on the way to the legislature. These types of physical barriers represent only a subsection of the barriers people with disabilities face in their everyday lives. The highest proportion of disability types are related to pain, but we know people also face disabilities impacting their flexibility, mobility, mental health, seeing, hearing, dexterity, learning, memory, developmental, and more. MLAs from all parties need to support Accessibility Week. We need to recognize that we need to make our spaces more accessible because I and many struggle with this every day. I've often met people out for a drink or a bite to eat and had to return home because the venue wasn't accessible. I used to chalk it up to the way things are, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can build a province where everyone is included, where everyone can participate fully in their communities. I'm here today talking to you in this House as a passionate advocate. It is with this passion that I urge this House to recognize the 4th Accessibility Week.
Thank you, member. Recognizing Kelowna Mission.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Well, I love the passion that I just heard. As today I rise in the House to speak positively to this motion, because I believe that this House wholeheartedly needs to affirm its commitment to building an inclusive province that improves the lives of people living with disabilities. This one is personal for me. Daniel was born 6 weeks early. He had a difficult delivery and was kept in the NICU for a few weeks. His brain didn't get enough oxygen, and he was diagnosed with dyskinetic ataxic cerebral palsy and a severe hearing impairment when he was 10 months old. Daniel's mom has fought for occupational, speech, and physiotherapies, for school integration, and for an equal chance for independence, education, a job, and ultimately, a future for her son. She had to pay for any modifications or special equipment necessary to level the playing field for his growth and future. I can still remember her tears when Daniel may have gone into the pool with his hearing aids on or lost one of them while he was having fun. Her background as a teacher, administrator, and professor enabled her to work towards a positive diagnosis and plan so that Daniel could have the best chance at an independent life and productive, positive future. I have watched Daniel struggle with simple physical tasks or miss out on opportunities because of a lack of accessibility where it should be there. People with disabilities are often forgotten, overlooked, or just plain not considered when designing our societal systems. And that's why accessibility is so important. And that's why those of us that can stand up and yell for accessibility is so important. Every British Columbian deserves to have equal access to employment, services, and the built environment. And it's not just Daniel that requires this commitment, 25% of the population does. But Daniel, well, he's a fighter, fiercely independent, strong, smart, and very funny. He has always had to work harder to overcome his physical limitations while performing tasks that are much easier for those without disabilities. My hope is that motions, but moreover commitments like these will be a step to leveling the playing field for others like Daniel, steps that lead to action and positive change. Considerations need to be made in all facets of our society. How we move, how we accommodate on transit, our housing, our businesses, and our education system. Daniel was at one time thought not to be able to read or write, but give him a computer and thoughts could pour out of his trapped mind. How do I know Daniel and his mom so well? Well, Daniel's my nephew, and his mom is my sister. Daniel is now 25 and a graduate of university, an active blogger on all things politics and sports. He is so smart. But the pandemic has been difficult for those with disabilities. A cold for Daniel is not the same as a cold for me. Daniel contracting COVID would be devastating. But Daniel was overlooked in many ways in this pandemic. And Daniel is only a symbol of the 25% of those with disabilities. Because despite being immunocompromised, ones like Daniel still had to take public transit. He was still required to go into the office he worked at. This pandemic was simply a light that shone through the cracks of missing legislation, missing societal norms, and gaps within our systems of care. This evidence of how the pandemic has affected our society provides us with an incredible opportunity to fix it, to make life easier and more accessible for everyone all of the time. But we must take this opportunity. We must stand up for those overlooked and make adjustments to give an equitable chance at independence and life, to make sure that we all benefit from the thoughts, contributions, and community that every British Columbian has to offer. My hope is that Daniel and other people with disabilities will be able to have stronger futures because of the work that we do in this legislature. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member. Recognizing Vancouver Falls Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support the motion, be it resolved that this House recognize the 4th Accessibility Week and reaffirm its commitment to building an inclusive province that improves the lives of people living with disabilities. Technology designed to include all users is called adaptive technology, or AT. AT is a broad category that includes both software and hardware. An example of adaptive software is Microsoft's Seeing AI, which uses artificial intelligence to describe the environment around you through the use of the camera on your smartphone, so that blind folks or folks with low visibility can have increased situational awareness. An example of AT hardware are things like adaptive keyboards and toggles and mechanical chairs. Technology and technologists have unlimited capacity to aid those living with disabilities to fully integrate into community, education, workplace, and society. Many tech advances have led to the opening of access for people living with disabilities. Tools such as screen readers, audiobooks, voice-to-text programs, geolocation tools, AI, and so much more. If you've not yet seen the incredible work going on in robotic exoskeletons, I encourage you to look it up online. These devices provide the ability for some people who've been unable to walk on their own while wearing the device. The relationship between people living with disabilities and the technology embedded into our daily lives can be fraught, depending on whether the tech has been built from the ground up with people with disabilities in mind or not, and whether people with disabilities have been involved in the creation of that tech or not. Last week, I visited Neil Squire Centre in Burnaby. Thanks to the team there for the incredible work and the fascinating tour. The guiding vision at Neil Squire is to achieve economic and social inclusiveness for all people with disabilities. The program that I found most compelling was Makers Making Change. This program leverages the capacity of community-based makers, occupational therapists, and volunteers to develop and deliver affordable, open-source assistive technologies. So what does this mean? Here's a great example. The LipSync wireless mouth mouse. This device was designed and refined by maker volunteers, community members, engineers, tinkerers, who volunteer their time to solve technical issues between what the user wants to do and what the product allows them to do. So in this case, the use challenge was using a touchscreen if hand dexterity does not allow. The LipSync device is a mounted device where the movement of a joystick by one's lips and a puff of air from one's mouth controls the cursor and touch features on an iPad. Neil Squire has more than 200 active volunteers, mostly engineers, working with clients to build or create the AT needed to fully access products that we all take for granted, such as our phones, computers, gaming consoles, screens, and even things like driving our cars or opening the oven. Makers design or build open source adaptive technology, often relying on 3D printers to print out the device once designed. All of the designs are open source, meaning the code of software or design and instruction of hardware are open for anyone to use from their website. They also have instructional videos. If a person prefers, they can be partnered with a maker who will build the device in question, asking only to be reimbursed for the cost of parts. And all devices are designed with simple, inexpensive parts that can be ordered easily or 3D printed at Neil Squire or elsewhere. So if the device the consumer requires isn't created yet, then a volunteer maker can work to create a solution that meets the needs of that user. I was so impressed by the range of adaptive technologies available on the Neil Squire website. I encourage you to check it out. Some tech companies have truly embedded adaptive technology into their company DNA. Apple is a great example. They've been a huge leader on the way that accessible design and providing a range of accessibility features and products come right out of the box. Simply put, iPhone has become the most powerful and popular assistive device ever. What stands out about Apple is that they seamlessly include accessibility into a device that all people can use universally. One example is VoiceOver, AT reading off the contents of the screen in a way that allows blind users to navigate OS easily. How have these companies like Apple, been so successful in their AT integration? Inclusion. Representation and inclusion are critical to getting AT right. The mantra of many living within the disability community is nothing about us without us. Companies that hire folks from the disability community to get these adaptive technologies right, they're the ones that are doing it right. And research indicates integrating folks with disabilities into product design improves the product overall for all users, not just those with disabilities. Hats off to the leaders in this space and to the makers, such as those working at the incredible Neil Squire Society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Skeena.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And on behalf of my constituents of Skeena, I am more than happy to address the following motion. Be it resolved that this House recognize the 4th Accessibility Week and reaffirm its commitment to building an inclusive province that improves the lives of people living with disabilities. I first gained insight into this issue when I sat on Highs Nation Council. We wanted to build more wheelchair ramps, purchase more chair lifts and aid equipment at home to help with beds and bathrooms. But the whole process was application-driven, so our response was limited to whatever government approved, especially when it was outside of our existing federal funding agreement. Now that my band has its own source revenues through title agreements, we have not only funded some of these services ourselves, but are even capable of offering benefits for our off-reserve members as well. But ultimately, my real insight into the world of people with disabilities didn't happen until I came here to the Legislature in 2017. At that time, we had 3 elected MLAs in the BC Liberal Caucus who used wheelchairs throughout the stone passageways of this Legislature that was designed with a 19th century approach to access and mobility that was virtually non-existent by today's standards. Now, the building has since seen a number of improvements, but at the end of the day, each MLA I knew experienced different difficulties unique to their own situation and abilities. Former MLA Sam Sullivan first sparked my curiosity when he thanked my offer to help, but my kind of help wouldn't do much good. That led me to ask him a whole bunch of questions about his unique set of difficulties and how he managed in a highly specialized wheelchair. Sam was very patient and kindly tolerated my ignorance and politely answered my questions. One time we were both late for our caucus meeting at the Legislature, and so I offered to walk with Sam and his wife, and she told me he would probably beat us both there because his wheelchair actually moved quite fast, which it did. I ran behind the whole way down Government Street. My next learning experience came from former MLA Michelle Stilwell. One night when we were departing from an event, I offered to help push Michelle up a hill, but couldn't find any handles on her wheelchair to push on. And her loud, somewhat fierce, and independent voice came out as she declined my offer. It wasn't a polite declination either. But as we talked more, I understood where her attitude came from. And as I got to know her even more, I began to realize she experienced a lot in life, but it was never enough to quell her competitive spirit or her exceptional will to be independent. The last insight I got was from our caucus chair, who I caught red-handed standing up beside her car after a day's end. And she explained to me the basics of blood circulation and that standing was still possible for some. So by seeing the world from different perspectives, I got even more inspired to learn more. I'll never forget playing wheelchair basketball with Michelle Stilwell and players from the Wounded Warriors Canada program here in Victoria. And it was that moment I saw the pride and determination of people who refused to give up, regardless of setbacks. It was inspiring, to say the least. So I have a different outlook when I come to a traffic stop or see a parking spot or a ramp. It makes me think about what it's like for someone who is hearing impaired, uses crutches, has limited sight, or doesn't have the use of their legs or arms. And it's not about special treatment. It's about having equal access to the same services that the rest of us take for granted at times. I'll leave you with one last thought. One day I was outside a restaurant here in Victoria getting ready to go inside with my fellow colleagues, but our caucus chair had stopped short at the entrance. When asked what was wrong, she informed us that the restaurant didn't have wheelchair access. I was stunned, angry, but felt crunched up inside thinking about how she felt about the simple act of trying to enter a place could possibly affect her whole day. And saying that, how could it affect her whole life? Her response was casual. It happens. It's no big deal. But it is a big deal. Not just for equality, but for the simple reason of inclusion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member recognizing the member for Langley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to rise to speak to the motion moved by my friend, the member for Chilliwack. Be it resolved that this House recognizes the 4th Accessibility Week and reaffirm its commitment to building an inclusive province that improves the lives of people living with disabilities. And there's 2 people in my life, Mr. Speaker, that have really opened up my eyes to the barriers and impacts that having a disability can bring to bear on somebody's life, and also to the lack of appropriate supports can have on folks. And, you know, they're both injured workers. One of them is my friend, the member for Chilliwack, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for over a decade now. And I've seen firsthand, you know, I'm thinking back to university, to college, being 2, I think, relatively good-looking young men trying to go out and find a spot to have a beverage, and seeing the problems that that can cause when there is no accessibility, when there is no ramp, and when there's nowhere appropriate to sit. And I've watched the member for Chilliwack come into this role and tirelessly focus on advocating for other folks, and that's really been, you know, the tenor of the spirit that he's brought to advocacy for his whole life. And it's really typical of the member for Chilliwack as well that he's not engaged in self-advocacy, he's busy fighting for others. Now, the second person, Mr. Speaker, is my mother. So my mother's a nurse, and I remember quite young, she had an injury that's very common among nurses, which is that she injured her back. It started off as a slipped disc leads to a surgery leads to a fused spine, and a fused spine leads to chronic pain, an inability to walk, properly in many ways, and a lifelong fight with WorkSafe to try to return to work and to try to get an appropriate accommodation so that she could continue working and eventually retrain and move on and become a professor of nursing at Douglas College. And my point here is that, you know, through my friendship with the member for Chilliwack, but also my own experience growing up with a mother with a disability, you know, you see firsthand the impacts that a helping hand can have to help reduce barriers and to help people lead their best lives. Because the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, there is a dignity to work outside of personal familial relationships, your marriage, your relationship with your parents, your child. The single most important relationship in somebody's life is work. It's where you spend the bulk of your time, and for many folks, it's where you get your sense of purpose and meaning. Returning to work and going through a return to work, it's not a single day, it's not a single event, it is a lifelong process that occurs over the course of someone's working life. Now, as legal counsel to a labor union, I was involved in that process firsthand for many grievers and for many members as they struggled to return to work with an injury, and often you would have an employer that would be looking for an accommodation, and a lot of very difficult realities around trying to manage the accommodation process and manage the return to work. And it is so important that we as legislators, that the government supports that process. And I'm proud to be a part of a government, Mr. Speaker, that's invested $6 million in the National Institute for Disability Management and Research over the next 4 years. That we've done that specifically to help promote disability management. I really want to reiterate management and process here, that this isn't a singular event, so that folks can get back to work. And part of what that funding is going to go to, and that funding has, really 3 strategies behind it. Promoting disability management programs, assessments and improvements, as well as educational development and professionalization. But a core part of that, and part of the professional designation component, are scholarships for part-time and full-time students enrolled in Bachelors of Disability Management programs. Because, we need to support the folks who are doing the critical work and helping support others so that we can all go on to lead our best lives, Mr. Speaker. Because no one should be regarded as less than because they have a barrier to their accessibility. And no one should have to go through those kinds of impacts. So I'd like to say, Mr. Speaker, that I strongly support this motion, and I strongly support the work of my friend, the MLA for Chilliwack. Thank you.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Kootenay East. You're on mute, Kootenay East.
It was off. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of my constituents of Kootenay East, I am pleased to support the following motion and will use my time this morning to explain why. But before I do, I would just like to use a few moments to offer on behalf of all the constituents of Kootenay East our sincere thoughts and prayers to all those in the Kamloops area and those survivors of the residential school system across the province. Today, I also send my prayers to the Tanakam Nation as well, whose traditional territories include Kootenay East. The St. Eugene Mission is just north of Cranbrook and was the site of a residential school from 1910 to 1970. And my friend Cheryl Cashmere is a survivor of that school and wishes more positive relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. True change can only happen when we work together, Mr. Speaker. And this is what she advocates for, and I couldn't agree more. Mr. Speaker, may we all pray for those 215 beautiful souls and the unthinkable loss that this tragically has been uncovered. So, Mr. Speaker, to speak to the motion that I wholeheartedly support, be it resolved that this House recognize the 4th Accessibility Week and reaffirm its commitment to building an inclusive province that improves the lives of people living with disabilities. When we think of disability as a concept, it's natural for us to relate to the last person we saw trying to access a building without the proper entrance facilities, or perhaps the pain of watching someone trying to navigate sidewalks that are not up to speed for people living with disabilities. However, rather than look for problems in this debate, Mr. Speaker, I think we should concentrate instead on finding appropriate solutions. According to the latest data gathered by Statistics Canada, an estimated 1 in 5 Canadians aged 15 and over had at least one or more disability that limited their daily activities. This is according to National 2017 Canadian Survey on Disability. And that's why I think this morning's debate is so important. Until we have a cumulative understanding of each and every one of the challenges that people living with disabilities face on a daily basis, both physical and mental, we won't be in the right position to help inform government policy. Those with more severe disabilities often have lower rates of employment, lower income, even when employed full year and full time, and a greater likelihood of living in poverty regardless of age. As an elected representative from rural British Columbia, I think it is also worth noting that there is a substantial difference in the challenges that people living with disabilities face between those living between urban and rural parts of the province. Urban and suburban parts of BC have a much wider tax base and therefore the ability to deliver far greater access compared to our rural counterparts. Therefore, those living with disabilities in rural parts of the province do face greater challenges because of fewer available resources. We need to change that, Mr. Speaker. Winter, spring, summer, or fall, my riding of Kootenay East presents its own set of challenges for those living with disabilities in small town BC, day or night. It's difficult, even at the best of times, for a fully able-bodied pedestrian to navigate rural sidewalks at night with no proper lit crossings, let alone deep snow. For people living with disabilities, this is nothing short of a complete disconnect from everything that most people enjoy without concern every day, This is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. We need a coordinated effort by all three levels of government. If we have a chance at making a difference in the general well-being of our whole society, city planning and bylaws need to coordinate with provincial legislation and federal funding for appropriate models for complete inclusiveness. Able-bodied people need more education and understanding on the barricades that face those with physical and mental disabilities. This can all be done with more conversation and focus. My colleague from Surrey South said it best on recognizing these challenges. She said, we have to see them and we have to make change. And she also said, if it's not accessible, it's not accessible. Although I wish I had more time in this debate, suffice to say that while we have made progress in making pathways to accessibility on many different levels, both mental and physical, much more remains to be done, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I support the motion on behalf of Kootenay East. Thank you.
Thank you, member. Recognizing North Vancouver, Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity to speak in support of the motion. I speak to you today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, where I have the opportunity to both live and learn. I also put my hand on my heart for those children, and I am so sad, and I know the people in my riding are so sad to acknowledge something that has been part of unknown knowledge before and is now truly been said as this is real and we have to see this. I would like to talk about a couple of other things that maybe have been spoken to in this time. I want to talk about the invisible population. We've heard Daniel's story where Daniel has a mom and an auntie who are very able to advocate on his behalf and have done many, many things that many other children with similar disabilities would never have the opportunity to access because their mothers and aunties and families have lobbied and advocated and rallied. There are many other people in our population that don't have those strong advocates, and as such, our society isn't able to recognize them and support them because they don't make it to that place. I speak of what I call our invisible population. We have children that are staying at home and cared for by their parents with some help perhaps from our health agencies or from our various organizations. But their parents are often full-time caregivers for the children. They can't access school. They can't access baseball. They can't access soccer. Though none of those things are available to them because of the way that they are dealing with their world. And when the families reach out for help and when the families reach out to advocate, sometimes they get that help and sometimes they don't. And sometimes their advocacy is heard and sometimes the energy that it takes to do that advocacy and do the care and try to have a life is too much. We talk about our youth. We talk about our youth who are in, let's talk about elementary school. School is supposed to be available and accessible to everybody. It's not. elementary school is not necessarily available and accessible to everybody of the appropriate age to be there. Again, there is many different things that have been done and can be done, many things that have not been done at all. And we have to look at each person and look at the community in which they are living and the environment that we're trying to support and get them there, support them to be there. And there are so many people that haven't even come to the surface. We talk about our 25%. I've heard many people say we have 25% of our adults in British Columbia and in Canada are dealing with disability. We have a lot of children behind that number too. And we have to remember them as well. We have to support them as well because they will become our adults. And I did hear somebody, Mr. Speaker, who indicated that that the growth of people, the numbers with disabilities is going to outstrip our birth rate. Absolutely it is. And our aging population is going to contribute to that as well. There is no reason at this day and age, it's 2021, by the way, that we should be having people saying, I can't do this because it's not accessible. That is just wrong. And it's not acceptable in our society. However, we've got to do the work and continue to do the work and demand that the work be done. I heard somebody else speaking, we need the 3 levels of government. We absolutely do. And that means we need to collaborate and work together and have goals that integrate, again, nothing about us without us. We've got to have our goals that integrate the people that we're working towards. I find it absolutely amazing when I see some great and wondrous plan put together by somebody that does not include the people that it impacts. We've got to learn from ourselves and from each other how to make this work. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity to support this motion in its fullness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Vancouver-Langara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, as we recognize National Accessibility Week, I am pleased to rise to continue the discussion on the motion before this House. Be it resolved that this House recognize the 4th Accessibility Week and reaffirm its commitment to building an inclusive province that improves the lives of people living with disabilities. It is certainly a motion needing considerable discussion in this House, and I appreciated the contributions of my colleagues to this discussion and the continued advocacy by many members of this House, including our former colleagues representing Vancouver Falls Creek and Parksville-Qualicum, as well as the member for Chilliwack and Surrey South. We learn a great deal from each other in all of this. Similarly, the work in this House to move forward with Bill 6, the Accessible British Columbia Act, is certainly a much-needed step towards modernizing our province's approach to accessibility. We have spoken a great deal in the past few years about what it means to make our communities more inclusive. A central component of that work must be to provide safe, inclusive, and accessible public spaces so that everyone can live and participate to their full potential. For too long, we've approached accessibility as an afterthought, or simply as a set of criteria that businesses are required to meet to be within the bounds of the law. But true inclusion goes far beyond simply doing the bare minimum. It involves looking at the world and the policies we design, from the built environment to social programs, through an accessibility lens, in a way that incorporates the lived experience of people with disabilities and truly seeks to ensure a world where everyone can take part to their full potential. This year's theme for National Accessibility Week is Disability Inclusion 2021, leaving no one behind. How do we ensure that in this House, through the work we do every day, that no one gets left behind? It's a question we need to continually ask ourselves. Our approach certainly needs some modernizing and attitudinal shift. There continues to be obvious gaps in the way that we approach accessibility. For example, in the city of Vancouver, there are no formal guidelines for designing accessible parks and outdoor spaces, which means that unfortunately many parks in the city cannot be equally appreciated and enjoyed by all. In contrast, cities like Campbell River have established guidelines for parks that set out appropriate dimensions for accessible signage, trails, and parking, all to improve park accessibility for users with physical, cognitive, and sensory disabilities. There also continues to be the need to increase the number of accessible public restrooms along TransLink's routes, as only the C-Bus terminals and West Coast Express trains currently have them, as opposed to what are effectively staffed bathrooms, which are only usable by asking a SkyTrain attendant. And none of the 6 underground stations for the planned Broadway subway will initially have accessible public restrooms either, only hypothetical possibilities of them being built in the future. We in this House have been elected to serve as MLAs because we want to make life better for our constituents, because we want to make our communities better, more equitable, more inclusive and accessible, where people can thrive and live full lives. We have all made commitments, as this motion suggests, to improve the lives of all British Columbians. This pandemic has disproportionately impacted people with disabilities, and we can't make decisions about recovery without taking this into account. We need to take a look at the lessons this pandemic has taught us and the gaps that have been revealed, and proactively ensure that we do not discriminate against people with disabilities. We must do better. Our discussion here is an important part of that work, and I hope that we will see the sentiments expressed today go beyond words and into real action. People living with disabilities face very real barriers every day in the built environment and in attitudes. And we in this House should feel an urgency to do our part to break down those barriers that can prevent people from being able to fully participate in society. Let's commit to working together to improve the lives of all British Columbians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Surrey Cloverdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The motion in part asks that the House reaffirm its commitment to building an inclusive province that improves the lives of people living with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, it was a few weeks ago that we heard from the MLA for Vancouver West End speak about his 4-year-old and fart bikes. It's not that when I think about accessibility, I think about fart bikes, but rather I think about a 4-year-old. And when they ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? I think about the upcoming legislation and moving forward and think about a 4-year-old with no barriers, and they can do whatever it is that they want to do when they grow up. When we all think about accessibility, you have to be excited about the creation of an Accessible British Columbia Act, which will build an inclusive province and works for all of us. The Act will remove the barriers so all people can fully participate in their communities. The Act will allow government to establish accessibility standards aimed at identifying and preventing barriers to accessibility and inclusion. Mr. Speaker, I'm familiar with some of the regulations that are currently in existence. As Surrey's former Chief Fire Prevention Officer, we were always ensuring building code and fire code regulations were being adhered to. When a fire alarm bell is ringing and someone needs to get out, there are many things to consider. Strobe lights for those with hearing disabilities, braille on doors and elevator keys for those with visual disabilities, emergency pull stations at the height for those in wheelchairs are just a few of the British Columbia Building Code and Fire Code regulations in use today. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the principle of nothing about us without us. It's important to note that James Charlton authored the book Nothing About Us Without Us in August of 2000. The term nothing about us without us expressed the conviction of people with disabilities that they know what's best for them. This mantra became the rallying call of the United Nations Convention of Human Persons with Disabilities, which was adopted in 2006. While we wait for Bill 6 to take some time to implement, we know it'll take some time, but it doesn't preclude local governments from moving forward on accessibility issues while this bill moves forward. In my riding, we have many civic facilities that have looked at accessibility as a main focus. In speaking with the Manager of Support Services and Accessibility, Tara Cleve, I was informed that Surrey's received 25 accessible certified designations and 5 accessibility gold certifications through the Rick Hansen Foundation. Surrey is currently the highest participating municipality in Canada. Surrey offers a range of adapted and inclusive programs in sport, leisure, recreation, which include wheelchair basketball, sledge hockey, chair yoga and fitness, audio book clubs, sensory-friendly spaces, inclusive cooking programs, and one-to-one skating and swim programs. I've been told that Surrey is currently working on updating their parking bylaws, which includes signage and parking stall requirements that would have helped out the MLA from Chilliwack. This leads me to a personal story of a friend and a colleague in his comments regarding accessibility. So Pete's chronic son, Todd, is a 33-year-old with cerebral palsy and hydrocephalus. A number of years ago, we engaged in a group conversation regarding the word handicapped. He spoke to the origin of the term and how it was not a word that anyone with a disability cared for. Cap in hand when connected to handicapped is a term that was offensive to Peter. I'm pleased to see my city, Surrey, is removing this type of signage from all the public areas, washrooms, and other public areas. I'm hopeful other private areas in my city and other cities in British Columbia will follow suit and not wait for the upcoming legislation of Bill 6. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take some time to address some concerns, one in particular a constituent has with regards to the perception that Bill 6 would lack inclusion of learning disabilities under the definition of impairment. This constituent who has a child diagnosed with learning disabilities, including dyslexia and ADHD. I can assure this mom, who's a physiotherapist, that this is enabling legislation. It provides a framework in which we can create regulations based on thorough consultation and consideration. It's not intended to create prescriptive lists that wouldn't be flexible in the future. Mr. Speaker, it's my hope that Erica, like many others who have contacted us, will be understanding of this definition and will know that it'll include all of those that have been diagnosed with learning disabilities. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to a better society for all British Columbians and when the Accessible British Columbia Act comes into full force and effect in the near future. I look forward to a day when the accessibility issues are so far in the past that we have to Google them the same way the 4-year-old Googles what a VCR was. Thank you.
Thank you, member. Recognizing the member for Cariboo North.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to recognize that I'm joining the debate today from the Southern Decath Nation, and my prayers are with all the residential school survivors and their families during this heartbreaking time. On behalf of my constituents of Cariboo North, it truly is humbling to join members of this legislature to recognize the 4th Accessibility Week and to reaffirm its commitment to building an inclusive province that improves the lives of people living with disabilities. I want to thank all of the members who have shared today. I especially want to acknowledge my colleague from Surrey South for her tireless efforts as an advocate for improving the lives of people living with disabilities. She has done this work both inside and outside of government, and I want to personally thank her for her leadership, her education of, and for the work that she continues to do. And I commit to this House that I'll join her call to action to get mad, to get loud, and to demand access for everyone. When we discuss the need for affordable housing, we need to be ensuring that we also have adaptive housing. Far more needs to be done, and I appreciate the member from Surrey South's advocacy on this. And another takeaway from the member's comments is to understand that people with disabilities are experts in innovation. Imagine the incredible potential of a post-pandemic world where everyone has access to and can participate in the rebuild of our magnificent province. Several weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, during one of our Children and Youth Committee meetings, I had a profound moment where the meeting will stay with me for a long time. We had the opportunity here to hear from Miles Himmerlich, a strong advocate to increase the understanding, support, and inclusion for children with FASD and their families. And I want to sincerely thank Miles for sharing his story, for being vulnerable, for standing up and helping us understand how all of us can help remove barriers. And I also want to thank the representative for Children and Youth and her team providing recommendations on how we all can be removing barriers when we look at legislation in this House. I also want to acknowledge the government today for the announcement that they have made for increasing support for students with disabilities enrolled in public secondary institutions. This work has been championed for many of the student associations, for the Alliance of BC Students, and I think it's important to hear from students, and when the government listens and makes improvements, that we acknowledge and recognize those efforts. The ACE program supports accessible post-secondary education for students who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deaf-blind and attending or planning to attend college or university in BC. The CAPER program that provides alternative learning format resource materials such as digital audiobooks, large print text, electronic text, and other suitable formats to students and instructors, and the pilot program that supports post-secondary students that require specialized adaptive technology. I know that we all share an incredible pride in our world-class post-secondary education system, and we understand that access to advanced education is essential to rebuilding BC's economy. And we must ensure that no British Columbian is left behind as the province moves forward. And despite the importance of post-secondary education for employment outcomes, students with disabilities still face significant barriers to accessing post-secondary education, and following completion of their degree, barriers to accessing employment. We must get loud, we must remove barriers, and there's so much more that we need to do. I want to recognize and thank the Alliance of BC Students for their advocacy on this topic. In particular, I want to thank June Reisner, who is the Accessibility Justice Coordinator and is the student at Capilano University, and Jessica Levesque, who attends Fraser Valley University. Their advocacy on improving inclusion at post-secondary is incredibly valuable, and I thank them for their efforts. From listening to the students, I gained a perspective and an awareness on the experiences students with disabilities face, including disruptions to their education due to financial, health, and accessibility constraints. Students with disabilities often take on exceptional additional costs, both directly and indirectly related to their education. It is critical that we recognize and understand invisible disabilities such as dyslexia. It's vital to apply a critical lens to our post-secondary institutions so that we can celebrate past achievements, but in so doing, develop a better understanding of what life is like with a disability. And so I am calling on the government with the request that the Alliance for BC Students have recommended that the province of British Columbia conduct a province-wide survey on the experience of students with disabilities in post-secondary education. I think this makes sense. In the minds of many, Mr. Speaker, if it's not accessible, then it's not acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, member. Recognize the member for Courtenay-Comox.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I rise in support of the motion by the member from Chilliwack to recognize our 4th Accessibility Week in British Columbia and reaffirm the commitment of this House to building an inclusive province that improves the lives of people living with disabilities. Accessibility Week is not only a time to celebrate all the incredible work being done by diligent and thoughtful people and organizations throughout BC to make it a more equitable and inclusive place for all. It's also a time to raise awareness and commit to doing our part individually and collectively to making life better for those with diverse abilities, those abilities that have not been fully recognized and accommodated in the mainstream. With nearly a quarter of BC's population aged 15 and older, that's more than 926,000 people living with disabilities, and the numbers are growing. It's apparent that we're not talking about just a small portion of society. And if you're not someone living with a distinct challenge to your ability to move, communicate, learn, understand, or cope with everyday matters, your life is more likely than not to be touched by such a person. We're talking about living with a disability as a regular part of everybody's life. In the spirit of nothing about us without us, our government swept the province in the fall of 2019 to consult with people with lived experience to help shape the development of accessibility legislation that would lead to standards and regulation, entrench the voice of those living with disabilities, and review to make sure we continue to make progress. My own community came out to the Comox Legion to share with the then minister their challenges and ideas for addressing their needs. I recall Jean sitting in her wheelchair speaking with passion and strength of purpose to address communication challenges and technology for the hard of hearing, reminding us of the range of experiences people with multiple disabilities strive in an exhausting daily trial to participate. I've ridden the bus with my sight-impaired friend, Michael McClellan, a tireless advocate for the disabled. And after he moved, he shared about the painstaking work to learn the lay of the land and travel in new places that the sighted only need a road map and bus schedule in hand to navigate. I have my own experiences of living with a cane on and off over many decades. People with transitory or episodic challenges or invisible disabilities also regularly face attitudes about justifying their lives. The need to reduce stigma is very real. I'm also grateful to John Higginbotham, who has made it his mission to entice newly elected Courtenay councillors and senior staff to tour the city with him on an electric scooter. A poorly placed bush at an intersection, inadequately designed public washrooms, experiencing the safety challenges and frustrations of navigating a walkable world does more than raise awareness and understanding. It elicits a compassionate response to make it right. And that's why it's exciting to see the focus of our government on building an equitable and inclusive BC that is accessible and improves the lives of people living with disabilities. Today, as we provide more programs and supports, doors are opening for a different world. Our government has raised disability rates many times, the latest being the single greatest increase ever. We've also raised the amount people can earn without clawbacks. We've supported people living with disabilities through the pandemic with income supplements and grant opportunities, work experience programs, and adjustments to grants and programs to give flexibility in these uncertain times. And we're dedicated to including people with disabilities in a strong recovery, building a more accessible, inclusive BC in childcare, affordable housing, school playgrounds, supports for post-secondary education, accessible government services, improvements to transportation in the built environment, communication tools and learning resources, technology, business supports, and so much more. We can be assured of continuing attention with the member from Chilliwack in the new position of Parliamentary Secretary for Accessibility. The Premier and our government continue to take steps to build a more inclusive British Columbia and improve the lives of people living with disabilities. As we move forward, Accessibility Week has more and more reason to celebrate together. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Noting the hour, member. Noting the hour.
I move adjournment of the debate.
Members, you heard the motion. All those participating remotely have your voting cards ready. All those in favor indicate aye. Those who oppose, motion carried. Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn.
Members, you heard the motion. All in favor indicate aye. Those who oppose indicate nay. Motion carried. This House stands adjourned until 1:30 in the afternoon.